Okay, in part two of this week's lecture topic, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Sigmund Baumann, an incredibly prolific sociologist who only just very recently passed away in his early 90s. Baumann led an incredibly interesting life, moved around the world, and it wasn't really until Baumann retired in 1990 where he became particularly prolific and even more influential than he was before then. He's particularly known for the notion of liquid modernity, and has written an incredible amount of books. He began with particularly analysing the notion of modernity through the notions of ambivalence in particular, and wrote a very influential book about modernity and the Holocaust. But since those times in the late 80s, from the 90s through to very recently, became thoroughly well known about his work in terms of consumerism and the different aspects of it, and through what he called liquid modernity in particular. So Baumann uses this idea of liquid as a kind of, I suppose, metaphor for thinking about the kind of demand for flexibility that we're increasingly under from all aspects of life, and the growing role of consumerism. This liquidity here is a kind of play on words from a very famous Marx quote, which is all that's solid melts into air. Baumann wants us to kind of think about how we may be stuck in a state between those two things. And we're in this kind of permanent sense of impermanence. And from a global level, this means that the ground increasingly moves under people's feet, but only the kind of privileged get a chance to do something about it and use mobility for their own advantages. Many others are pushed and pulled around the world by forces beyond their control. So, as he argues, the ground shifts between the feet of a burgeoning number of people, but it leaves them with nowhere to go. And Baumann's work has been particularly, I think, useful for thinking about notions of migrations and refugees. So his work on liquid modernity was a kind of intervention of social theory, particularly around the time when postmodernism and post-structuralism was quite predominant in social theory. And Baumann, I suppose, brings in aspects of that kind of thought, but also from more traditional thinkers, such as Marx and Weber, Durkheim, many others, to kind of bring this notion of liquid modernity together. In his more recent work throughout the 90s and 2000s, Baumann became particularly interested in what consumerism and consumer culture was kind of, and the influence it was having on our lives. Interested on a global scale, but also in the kind of individual scale as well. For those in the West, in the kind of more comfortable consumer situations, Baumann argued that basically our lives were we increasingly treat our lives as an artwork. We're the artists in that sense of our own lives. Now here we don't necessarily all have the skills to be a successful artist in this sense, but what he's talking about here is it's up to individuals increasingly to give their own lives purpose. And this reflects a lot of the work around detraditionalisation, where we're not necessarily born into fixed roles anymore. So we're taught from an early age that it's up to us to make the right decisions, to make the right choices, to be happy. Increasingly that's done through consumer society, but the happiness and satisfactions provided by consumer society are elusive and ephemeral. In one of his last books, he wrote a book called Does Ethics Have a Chance in a World of Consumers? And he was encouraging us to, us meaning sociologists, but public more generally, to start thinking about ways that maybe governments can governments, communities and individuals can have more influence over, how happiness is defined and achieved, rather than leaving up to the consumer market. One of the more interesting things that Baumann has to say is that in a consumer society, in consumer culture, that individuals themselves, that people are now in many ways just like consumer products, to the point where he saw it becoming so pervasive that consumerism was consuming life itself. So for Baumann now, individuals are simultaneously both the promoters of commodities and the commodities they promote. People are merchandise and marketers. They're the goods and the travelling salespeople. So this kind of idea here is that consumers over the past couple of decades have themselves turned into commodities. Now, you would argue that in some ways we've always been sales people of ourselves, in the sense that, if you want to get a good job, you've got to present a good version of yourself. If you're, out trying to meet a partner, you're trying to performing a various version of yourself, and this goes all the way back to Goffman. But for Baumann, this kind of logic of presentation of the self, and how that presentation is done more and more like we're a commodity, like we're an actual individual brand, is increasingly the norm. And this is particularly the case through the saturation of media and the rise of things like MySpace and Facebook throughout the last couple of decades. So here Baumann argues that people are just like commodities now, and that's a problem in terms of humanistic ethics, as we kind of therefore relate to others more as things than as humans. Now, Baumann has really influenced and kind of a magpie from many different theoretical perspectives. He brings a lot of things together. You can hear, I'd say, already echoes of the Frankfurt School in Baumann's work. You can see this here. He talks about how consumerism must just create desires. It can't really create satisfaction. But he argues too that people must want to be seduced, as a kind of anthropological kind of Daniel Miller aspect that kind of comes through his work as well. But for Baumann, it's increasingly impossible to live your life as anything but a consumer in today's world. And this, in that kind of pseudo-individualisation way that Adorno wrote about, kind of disguises the exercise of free will. Much of the things we think we're choosing from this Baumannesque perspective aren't really choices, they're just things provided to us by the culture industry. Now, in many ways, Baumann has very similar kind of Frankfurt School things to say in terms of what it means to be a consumer. He also brings a kind of strong moral philosophy into this as well. I would strongly suggest Baumann as someone that everyone should read. He's a really great writer, really brings together a lot of different perspectives, and almost writes, like he's writing literature more than social theory. He had really interesting things to say about how these recent changes, what it means in terms of being poor in this kind of new consumer world. In one of my favourite books of his, work, Consumerism and the New Poor, he argued that very idea of what it means to be poor has been rewritten in these past couple of decades in the move to consumer society. Where being poor once derived its condition from being unemployed, and it still kind of does that, but for Baumann today, the way that the kind of status and the morals around these notions are dominated is through the plight of being a flawed consumer. And this relates to the very notion of identity here, that the idea that many people today try and express their identity, their self-identity, more in terms of the things that they consume rather than the things they produce. So here Baumann moves away from Weber's idea that we were kind of impelled to have a work ethic that comes from that Protestantism that Weber was writing about centuries ago, that we're now impelled to have a consumer ethic. And we kind of need to display that ethic through, constant consumption. In relation to the kind of new ways of being poor, Baumann sketched out in a book called Globalisation, the Human Consequences, two global classes in a way that kind of reflects Marx's bourgeoisie and proletariat. Here, the ruling class are the tourists and the working class are the vagabonds. They live in this same global consumer economy, but they have such a different experience and outlook on life. And what we relate to what Bourdieu would call habitus here, that they barely understand each other, and particularly the tourist sees mostly the vagabond as a dangerous other. So globalisation and the consumer culture around it is kind of geared towards satisfying the tourist's needs, dreams and desires, and these forces push the vagabond into a position where they can't be a tourist, but they can't also stay put. And again, much of the kind of movement around the world in terms of people migrating to try and find jobs or to avoid wars or avoid slave labour and exploitation relates to this. So the tourist here is a kind of the wealthy 20% of the globe, and the vagabond is the other 80%, if you want to think about it in these kind of quantitative terms. So I've left some kind of quotes in here from Baumann, just if you're interested in for you to read, where he kind of explains what the relationship is between these two global classes. And it's important to understand that the life worlds kind of depend on the knowledge of the other. The vagabond sees the tourist as something that both is the oppressor but also something to aspire to, while the tourist sees the vagabond as the kind of the nightmare of not being the kind of hardworking consumer and hardworking, careerist. For Baumann, this polarization of the class system across the globe isn't some kind of disturbing kind of side effect. It's actually driven by the very economy that dominates these things itself. So here he comes up with new concepts of thinking about what it means to be poor, to be exploited, to be alienated, and often to be just pushed out of this kind of global consumer system. He talks about flawed consumers, and that what he ends up calling people with wasted lives are the collateral casualties of consumerism. Collateral damages here, in terms of these people that are pushed out, relate to kind of the new frailty of interhuman bonds resulting from the transfer of consumerist patterns upon relations and humans. So Baumann wants us to rethink what it means to be poor and what it means to be left out here. In a really kind of heartbreaking book, the book Wasted Lives, he talks about how global consumer culture increasingly sees many people be kind of defined or being pushed towards being defined as human waste. That they're excessive, redundant, they're not necessarily needed by the system, and they're pushed out and kind of put into situations where just living a kind of dignified life becomes increasingly difficult. For Baumann, this is a polarising system that kind of splits us up between us and them, the tourist and vagabond. And he has some very interesting things to say about the ways that even those that are marginalised, when they try to do the so-called right thing, are also seen through, this kind of relational lens. So in relation to this too, Baumann kind of wrote a couple of interesting opinion pieces about how those pushed out, and this is what he was talking in particular about. People living in poor areas in London reacted and had riots a few years ago. So he argues that they were kind of the first consumer riots of the West, where people living in poverty, people who were, constantly kind of battered with the idea that they're flawed consumers, seen as kind of low status, called chavs and the like, reacted, and there was this kind of spark of rebellion against what was going on at the time. So if you're interested in the notion of how people in urban centres may kind of spontaneously react against this kind of stuff, have a look at what Baumann has to say in terms of the London riots.